So, good day, everybody. Apologies once more for the bad lighting conditions and perhaps the sound. And you can see my dog in the background, as I've explained in previous videos. I'm actually on holiday at the moment in the Peak District in England. But as I also said, I'm going to continue to give you brief, regular updates about the situation as I understand it. Firstly, we've had further news of more advances by the Russian army in Donbass. As I discussed yesterday, the important town of Svyatogorsk has now been captured by the Russians. The earlier claims by the Ukrainians to have recovered ground in Severodonetsk have turned out to be not just untrue, but they're provoking a great deal of recriminations amongst Ukrainian commentators. There's now increasing criticism of President Zelensky and of his governor in Lugansk, Sergei Gadai, for actually making these claims. And there's now mounting criticism of the practice by the Ukrainians of trying to hold every inch of territory in Donbass, sacrificing large numbers of soldiers in frankly what are hopeless battles. And I'm going to come back to also the comment that I have made in the past, which is that the Russian strategy in Ukraine throughout has not been so much to capture cities or towns or particular territories. It has been to defeat and destroy the Ukrainian army as an organized force. That is very much consistent with Russian philosophy, war philosophies, and in fact it is exactly what the Russians are doing. And this Ukrainian practice of defending every inch of territory is actually working to the advantage of the Russians. It helps them to carry through with this strategy of basically defeating and destroying the Ukrainian army as an organized force. This is in contrast to what the United States did or does in other wars, in Iraq, for example, in 2003, where the United States made a beeline for Baghdad, captured Baghdad, but the Iraqi army was not defeated in battle. It still existed. The soldiers dispersed to their towns, still armed, in most cases, like the Taliban did in Afghanistan. And the result was that after a period of, shall we say, quiet pacification, when people started to recover their nerve, they began to come back and start attacking the Americans again. Well, the Russians, operating under the philosophy of Klaus von Clausewitz, who was the German theorist of war, who actually served with the Russian army at one time, as I've discussed in many programs, they take a completely different approach. For them, it's not territory that matters. It is destroying, as Clausewitz said, the will of the enemy by defeating and destroying his army. And I'm afraid that's what's happening, and it will continue to happen up to that moment when Ukraine sits down and starts negotiating with the Russians in earnest, moving forward from what happened from the proposals that were made in Istanbul back in March, when the Ukrainians made proposals which seemed to meet the Russian demands halfway. The Russians interpreted it as a sign that the Ukrainians were coming round to negotiating seriously about a settlement of the long-standing conflict in Ukraine. And for a brief period of time, the prospects of peace and of a settlement of the war, ending all this death and destruction, looked bright. And instead, everything went into reverse. And the person who perhaps bears the greatest responsibility, is Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, who telephoned President Zelensky directly after the meeting in Istanbul between the Ukrainian and Russian negotiators, told President Zelensky, and this he did after he discussed the matters with the Biden administration, told President Zelensky that if Ukraine was considering making any territorial compromises, then Britain and the United States would not give Ukraine the security guarantees that Zelensky needed in order to explain to the Ukrainian people why Ukraine would not be joining NATO. And moreover, Johnson and again the United States promised Ukraine that if Ukraine continued to fight, there would be a vast flood of Western weapons which would pour into Ukraine and would turn the tide of the battle. And a few weeks later, Boris Johnson went to Kiev and he spoke directly with Zelensky, and he repeated all these same points that he'd made to Zelensky over the telephone, and he was followed a short time after that by Secretary Blinken of the United States, Secretary of State Blinken, and Defense Secretary Austin, who also apparently told Zelensky the same thing. So the result was that Ukraine took an absolutist position. They said that after the events in northern Kiev, where the Russian troops had supposedly carried out atrocities, that there was no question of any further negotiations with the Russians. They said that Ukraine would fight on until victory was achieved. They started to pitch their terms of victory with British encouragement at fanciful and impossible levels, saying that they would recapture the whole of Donbass and Crimea as well. And the result is this war, which is now turning into an absolute disaster for Ukraine, in which thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are dying, trying to hold unachievable positions, undefendable positions, and with the Ukrainians now having set their demands for victory at such a high level that one feels that it's going to be very difficult for President Zelensky, for his foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba, for Arestovich, his spokesman, for all of these people to turn round now and say that, well, actually, we cannot continue the war in the way that we're doing. We have to return to the Istanbul process, and all those hundreds, thousands of lives that have been lost in the ensuing months were thrown away for nothing. So it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to do that. But that is what they must now, I say, must do. And I'm not the only person now who's saying it. Henry Kissinger said it at the conference at the World Economic Forum in Davos about 2 weeks ago. I understand that Edward Ludwig, whom I had not even been aware was still alive, but apparently he is, and he's the best known strategist apparently. Anyway, I've seen a report that he's briefed the State Department in Washington, telling them the same thing, that this is what Ukraine must do. I haven't heard of Ludwig for a very, very long time, so I'd assumed that he'd left us, but apparently he hasn't. But in any event, if this is a mistaken report, lots of other people are saying it too. We've had reports from the Washington Post, from the New York Times, from all sorts of people and places, all of them saying the same thing. Ukraine cannot win this war. There will not be enough Western weapons to turn the tide, and in view of this, Ukraine must sit down and negotiate in earnest and bring this war to an end. The terms will no doubt be less favourable than those that might have been achieved in March, but better whatever terms are now proposed by the Russian side than a disaster, a collapse that might come, and of course better that than the throwing away of lives to no useful purpose. I'm going to make just two further observations. The first is that the Russians might still be willing to compromise on certain important issues. Now, Yesterday, in my previous video, I discussed, and indeed I quoted extensively from an interview that President Putin gave with Russia 1 television, in which basically he discussed economic issues, the way in which, as far as he was concerned, it was the West that had brought about the crises in energy and food through misconceived economic policies extending back many years, but aggravated by the responses to the pandemic of the last few years, and of course the sanctions. One thing that did strike me about that particular interview is that when he was referring to the conflict in Ukraine, President Putin spoke about the special operation, the Russian military special operation in Ukraine, and then he corrected himself and said Donbass. And then he was very careful in the rest of the interview to speak specifically of Donbass rather than Ukraine as a whole. Now, I think at the beginning it was what we might call a Freudian slip, in the sense that I think that Russia is now thinking definitely beyond Donbass. I mean, we've discussed in previous programs how they've made very clear that they're not pulling back from Kherson region, from Zaporozhye either, and the Ukrainians also seem to think, by the way, that after the Russians have finished their operation in Donbass, Zaporozhye will be their next target, and President Zelensky has now made comments to that effect. He said that the most dangerous point of the battle is for the moment for the Ukrainians, is Zaporozhye, where the regional capital is now under threat. But anyway, even though I suspect the Russians are now thinking beyond Donbass, Putin was very careful to correct himself to talk only of Donbass in this interview. And I think the reason he did that was that he was giving the Ukrainians space to come to the negotiating table, to sit down and to negotiate. So they don't have to go into the negotiating room already acknowledging that other regions of Ukraine are going to be detached from Ukraine as well as Donbass. That's something that the Russians are prepared to work through over the process of negotiations. Now, that's not a concession from Putin, but it does, it seems to me, help the Ukrainians. It does leave the door ajar for negotiations. And of course, he also spoke about how Russia is prepared to help Ukraine reopen its ports, Odessa specifically, if the Ukrainians start taking various steps like demining these ports, raising these ships they sunk in Odessa harbor, those sort of things. He said that the Russians would, in effect, observe a naval ceasefire to allow Ukraine's grain ships to leave Odessa. Again, I don't know whether Putin expects that that's what the Ukrainians are going to do, but it seems to me that, again, he was saying these sort of things, partly, obviously, to show that Russia is not responsible for the global food crisis, but also, again, to emphasize to the Ukrainians, to make it clear to the Ukrainians that the door for negotiations is open. They can discuss the food issue, they can discuss access to the port of Odessa, and of course they can talk about other matters. And it's perhaps worth pointing out at this point that after the Istanbul proposals that the Ukrainians made, the Russians put counterproposals to the Ukrainians. We've never seen them. Ukraine has never responded to them. Zelensky, very foolishly, in my opinion, pretended that they'd never been sent at all, even though they clearly have been. The first step that the Ukrainians need to take is they need to respond formally to those Russian counterproposals. It's probable, it's likely that the Russians will say, well, those counterproposals were made in the context of the negotiation in March in Istanbul. The situation has now changed, and we're going to harden our proposals beyond our counterproposals beyond those that we made following the talks in Istanbul. But at least it provides the Ukrainians an opportunity, a mechanism to resume the talks without appearing to be, dragged to the negotiating table, which Zelensky might find difficult to justify or explain in Ukraine. Now, I appreciate there are going to be some people watching this program who are going to say that, negotiations is not the way to end this war, that the way to do it is for Russia to disregard any proposal Ukraine makes, any proposal coming from the West, march all the way to Lviv, to Ukraine's western frontiers, achieve a military victory over Ukraine. Well, that may be what the Russians will eventually do. But all I am saying is that is not, in my opinion, what Ukraine at this moment needs to do. I think Ukraine, on the contrary, needs to get its own negotiating position sorted out fast and hope that the Russians, despite the aggravation they must undoubtedly feel after the collapse of the talks in March and the campaign, the media campaign that was conducted afterwards, and despite the fact that they're now unequivocally winning the war, perhaps the Russians, President Putin himself, might decide that some kind of negotiation serves their interest better at this point than outright victory, which might present them with international complications, might not play very well with countries like India and China, for example. And of course, beyond that, from a Russian point of view, pursuing outright victory is also going to cost Russian lives. So that's what I think Ukraine needs to do. If it doesn't, it's going to lose the whole of Donbass. The press spokesman, Zelensky's press spokesman, Arestovich, is now talking about Slavyansk being about to come under siege. I cannot see the logic to this. I cannot see what the logic is of pressing on with a war which Ukraine is clearly losing, and where these hopes of floods of Western weapons are simply not going to be materializing. Now, there is one major obstacle to Ukraine resuming negotiations, which looks like it might be removed before very long. I mentioned Boris Johnson's role in wrecking the negotiations that seemed to have some promise in March. It looks likely that we're going to be seeing the back of Boris Johnson before very long. He has just suffered a humiliation in that he was forced to go through a vote of no confidence brought against him by his own MPs, his own Conservative MPs in the British Parliament. He still won a majority of those MPs. The vote was 211 supporting Johnson against 148 Conservative MPs who said that they had no confidence in Boris Johnson. However, the iron law of British politics, the iron law of British Conservative politics, is that when a Conservative Prime Minister has lost the confidence of 40% of his parliamentary party, he is fatally wounded politically. And before very long, I expect that we will see the back of Boris Johnson. Now, who will take over from Boris Johnson at the moment, nobody knows. But there is some talk that it may be the former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, who is not a member of Boris Johnson's cabinet. And it's conceivable that Jeremy Hunt, who is known to be a more professional diplomat, if I can put it like that, than Johnson himself, and perhaps a more realistic one, and who obviously comes without any kind of political baggage, especially where Ukraine is concerned, it's possible that Jeremy Hunt may take a more realistic approach to this whole Ukrainian crisis. He might be someone who, instead of taking this impossibly hard line that Boris Johnson has been taking, this hard line which has been repeatedly harder than that of the Ukrainians themselves, that it's possible that Jeremy Hunt might decide that he's going to try and facilitate negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians rather than try and obstruct them. Well, of course, that's far from certain. And of course, it's far from certain that Jeremy Hunt will be the person who will eventually succeed Boris Johnson. At the moment, the field looks completely open. But I still feel that if Boris Johnson goes, no British successor will have either the authority or perhaps the level of personal investment in the Ukrainian crisis to take the extremely hard, intransigent line that he has taken. Now, I don't want to overstate Britain's importance in this issue, in this conflict. Obviously, Britain isn't the biggest player on the Western side. By far, that is the United States. And of course, Germany is the biggest player on the European side. But I do get the sense that in the United States, enthusiasm for the war is waning, even within the current administration, the Biden administration. We saw that editorial by the New York Times 2 weeks ago, which basically called on Ukraine to be realistic and to entertain territorial concessions. I suspect the same is true in Germany. I think that the hardline, pro-Ukrainian, pro-war politicians within the German government, Habeck and Baerbock, are starting to become isolated, especially as the German business community becomes increasingly alarmed about the way in which the conflict is causing economic damage. I would have thought that with the most obvious, the most prominent hardline leader amongst the Western powers, leading a major Western power, Boris Johnson, removed from the scene, the window for negotiations might be starting to open. Now, of course, all this depends on what the Ukrainians do. It also depends, obviously, on how the Russians respond, whether the Russians are in a mood to negotiate with the Ukrainians after all that's happened. I don't know. But as I said, there are indications from Putin that they might be. I think the Ukrainians need to test that. Whether President Zelensky and his officials have enough support amongst their, well, let's not say their people. Well, I get the sense, by the way, that amongst the Ukrainian people, war weariness is now very powerful. But within the Ukrainian political class, let's say, put it that way, I don't know. But anyway, that is what needs to happen. If it doesn't happen, there will be more Ukrainian defeats. Ukraine will lose Donbass. Ukraine will lose Zaporozhye. There will be further Russian advances across the rest of Ukraine. There will be military defeats. There will be many, many losses of people. Many people will die. And of course, the outcome, the eventual outcome, will be a war that will not end through a diplomatic settlement, but through the Russians dictating terms. Now, I can't see how that benefits Ukraine. I certainly can't see how that benefits the West. It seems to me that the imperative to do a deal is becoming stronger, not so much by the day, but by the hour. Let's hope and see whether the Western powers and whether the Ukrainian government makes the difficult decisions that they need to make. Obviously, I will continue to observe the situation and provide you with my analysis, and I'm doing it, as you can see, even whilst I'm on leave. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can watch us on other platforms like Rumble and Locals, and of course also ODYSEE and SuperU, and we now have a thriving Telegram channel, and you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop where you'll find all sorts of great things: t-shirts, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, bomber jackets, all sorts of great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. That's enough for me today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.